Good evening. This is Kate Geiger, and this is Points of Culture. For those of you who are just joining us, Points of Culture is something that we at the library noticed something was happening during COVID, and that is that so many of our cultural events were either canceled or called off or just kind of going underground. And so Points of Culture is a way that we can kind of feature the things in our community that have been happening or that can happen that really focus on a lot of different kinds of culture that we have locally. And tonight we have a very special night because Sue Welsh, who has recently retired from Indiana University of Pennsylvania, has taught writing for how many years, Sue?
Oh dear, 30.
A lot of years teaching people to write stories. And so tonight we're featuring storytelling because in the library, I just felt like that was a subject that ought to be covered. People love stories. They love reading stories. We love telling stories. And whether it's, journalistic kind of stories through news or just the kind of things that we do day by day, telling stories. Storytelling is an art. And at one time it was an oral art, but, we write things down, we put them in books for many years, and now there are things like blogs and other kinds of ways, new ways to tell stories. But it's a big part of our culture. So when people think of libraries, they think about books and stories. And I think bringing out some of those interesting parts of storytelling and authorship and developing stories would be of interest to library patrons and just people around town. So Sue, I'm really glad to have you with us here tonight. And just to focus and to get started, we've been telling stories for many years, and it started with, really as soon as people could speak, there was a way to tell someone else something that had happened. So oral stories, we do it for so many reasons, but why do you think we tell each other stories?
Well, I think we tell each other stories because life is random. It's often chaotic. And stories help us order our knowledge about our living. I asked my daughter just this morning, she's a story writer, and she said, stories keep us alive. And she also said, we tell stories to make sense of our lives.
Yes.
And I thought I would just read you not with a story, but with a ballad, an old ballad.
Wonderful.
And it's called Sir John Barleycorn.
Oh.
Every ballad tells a story, and this is a story about how beer is made. There came 3 men from out of the west, their victory to try. And they have taken a solemn oath, poor Barleycorn should die. They took a plow and plowed him in, clods harrowed on his head. And then they took a solemn oath, John Barleycorn was dead. There he lay, sleeping in the ground, the rain on him did fall. Then Barleycorn sprung up his head and so amazed them all. Then he remained till midsummer and looked both pale and wan. Then Barleycorn he got a beard and so became a man. Then they sent men with scythes so sharp to cut him off at the knee. And then poor John Barleycorn they served most barbarously. Then they sent men with pitchforks strong to pierce him through the heart. And like a doleful tragedy, they bound him in a cart. And then they brought him to a barn, a prisoner to endure. And so they fetched him out again and laid him on the floor. Then they set him with holly clubs to beat the flesh from the bones, but the miller served him worse than that. He ground him twixt 2 stones. Oh, barleycorn is the choicest grain that ever was sown on land. It will do more than any grain by the turning of your hand. This is a story about community making sense of its own agrarian life. And so one of the things stories do is return us to our community, envision our community, and leave us with some feeling of having gained something. And in a lovely book I have of John Barleycorn's ballad, here is the boon.
Oh.
Sitting at your hearth with a pint of your own. That's a story that goes way back. And when we say that stories help us make sense of our lives, many stories, especially the old ballads, once they become anthologized later on in the 18th century, the writers begin to attach a moral. So this moral gets attached to that old medieval story. And it's one way that people begin to make even more sense of a story that's already pleasant as it is. It will make a boy into a man into an ass. To silver it will change your gold, your silver into brass. It will make the huntsman hunt the fox that never wound a horn. It will bring the tinker to the stocks that people may him scorn. Oh, barley corn is the choicest grain that ever was sown on land, and it will cause a man to drink till he neither can go nor stand. So it becomes a cautionary ballad in its rebirth in the 18th century. And this happens to stories, as you know, they get passed down and they change from culture to culture. So when literacy increases, I guess the moral attachment gets placed onto the story as well.
Yeah. Well, stories tell there are many different reasons for a story, but I would think that teaching was probably one of the earlier uses of story because of the oral traditions, teaching about family lore and things that were just, that was the way you passed things on down. So,
yeah.
And if it's a good story, people remember it.
They do, particularly if you make it a song.
Mm-hmm. If you think about stories, and you think about life, and it is a way to make sense out of life. But I wonder about, stories mostly have a beginning, middle, and end, and yet is there really an end? I mean, there's for so many things, is there an ending? Because sometimes it's just where we stop telling the story, but there's more that comes after. So sometimes in stories, we like those nice tidy endings, and other times feels like there's no resolve. So, how is it that we kind of reach for that? Why do you think we want an ending, a good ending?
Yeah, I guess the best endings are funny, but it depends. The ale, the making of ale, can be quite lead to a pleasant product, but the moral that's attached onto it says, well, it depends on the user. It's a good thing, but it can be a bad thing. So in a way, there's an open ending, even in the ballad, even in the traditional ballad.
For the one who's not still standing.
Right. One could be hurt, or one may not be hurt. C.S. Lewis was a great lover of stories. He believed in open access to uncensored literature.
Yeah.
He thought this was really crucial. Because we weren't meant to be imprisoned as a single self. We, in fact, need that openness. So he said, we demand windows. And literature is a series of windows, even of doors. Reading literature can be described either as an enlargement or a temporary annihilation of the self. But that's an old paradox. He that loses his life shall save it.
Mm-hmm.
We therefore delight to enter into other men's beliefs, he wrote, even though we think them untrue, and into their passions, though we might think them depraved. Literary experience heals the wound without undermining individuality.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, it's a real healer. And he's pointing to these two things, C.S. Lewis, is the healing power of stories and the importance of hearing many perspectives, opening a lot of windows into the world that you live in.
Mm-hmm.
There's a poet named Claudia Rankine, and she says, we each build individual pathways so we can hold ourselves together.
Oh, wow.
And so we build to heal through hearing or imbibing new perspectives. And, it's funny, I kind of feel compelled to do a little bit of history as well as some sample stories. So I thought this theme of windows and perspective taking really comes onto my plate as someone who also taught literature in the Decameron of Boccaccio, which is a 14th century collection of tales told in the context of a plague in Florence in the middle of the 14th century. And it's interesting because he, even so long ago, said, well, I'm a rather young man, and I've went through a period of very painful, unrequited love. And what got me out of that melancholy was a series of friends who would come visit me and tell me stories. And he gathered a number of people in a local church. 7 women and 6 men, and he invited them to leave Florence, go out to a countryside home, and begin to tell stories during the plague. So it's a direct relationship between pandemic and history of storytelling.
Not so far removed.
Yes. The first story in that collection is the narrator's story, the person who you would say might be Boccaccio, but it's a narrator that he creates. And he tells the story of the plague. It's actually a history. And it's very exciting to us because it recounts the symptoms of the plague and how he first encountered it and how people reacted so differently to it. Some using excess, life is short, eat, drink, and be merry, and some choosing moderation, which is lock down and enjoy what you can, and then choosing flight, and that's the one that his tellers choose. So he starts that process through a story that is actually historical. And like you, Kate, I've talked to you about this. I love stories that are also historical, as well as stories that are fictional.
Historical fiction, narrative nonfiction. Yeah, I do love those stories.
So there is Boccaccio, who has the frame of history around the storytelling of all of his characters. And I think we're invited to enjoy both. And he says, this storytelling moved him out of his melancholy, and he hopes that the series of stories he can tell will bring pleasure and useful counsel. That is advice to live by. So here we are back to the original motive. So there's a great deal, even in the old storytellers, as they bring it together. 500 years later, we've got Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death. If you move away from history, there's nothing like Gothic fiction.
Right.
and a very different voice. The Mask of the Red Death is about a group that also goes to a palace outside of a town in Italy, and they have a party. I'll just read one paragraph.
Okay.
The other apartments in the palace were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life, and the revel went whirlingly on until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock. And then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who reveled. And thus, too, it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure, which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur, expressive of disapprobation and surprise, and finally of terror, of horror, and of disgust. And that's the pivot in the story that takes you from the party into the visit of the plague. And,
How appropriate.
yeah,
You.
not at all a historical voice, but the storytellers create anxiety.
Yes. Actually, I think that title is listed in the 1001 books that you have to read before you die.
Oh, oh dear. Another problem to deal with.
Yeah, I actually was leafing through that as a reference book. I don't know why, but I found that a number of the early stories, I'm about halfway there. So I don't know. I have to read faster, I guess.
No. And just to put one more voice on the plate, and this is literary nonfiction.
Okay.
The writer Wanda Coleman, and it points to another reason that we write, which is to solve problems in our communities. Coleman, she's a Black writer, and she married a white Jewish man, and she writes about the encounters that this led to, many of them tinged with racism, traveling both ways. How dare you marry a white man, but also how dare he marry a Black woman? But this one anecdote is just about one encounter that their marriage helps them solve. But the encounter, I'll read it. So while her hus, she calls him hus, while hus nurses his frozen yogurt at Glendale Mall rest stop, I step into a luggage boutique. I answer the ugly glare of the owner with an awkward nod, and then I examine the stock. I decide on a slender, wine-colored tote. At the register, I present my check and requisite IDs. Credit card or cash, he admonishes. Thrown, I leave angrily, swallowing epithets. Did you find anything? Hus asks. Yeah, but my check was refused. I'm too Black for him. Ridiculous. Come on, I'll get it for you. He marches me back into the shop. My wife was in here to buy a briefcase. Where is it? Flustered, the owner reaches under the counter. Sweetheart, is that the one? I nod. We'll take it. Authoritatively, he plucks a check from his wallet without a word. The owner bags the case. I told you they'd take a check, Hus says when we get outside. Yeah, a smirk from you.
Mm.
So
Mm.
the outlines of racism are constantly sorted out in their
Yeah.
living and in their talking.
Day-to-day life.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
But it's,
Any of those.
yeah, taking care of our lives through storytelling.
Well, and sometimes just, the experience that you have, it's hard to believe, it's shocking. You don't necessarily have to invent those kind of things.
Wow, you just listen.
Fiction is a way of doing that, but
Right.
life has its own.
Yeah.
And it's easy to see how storytellers from different times and different ways bring something to the surface, or bring out a certain aspect, but there's a lot that kind of falls behind in the background too. Why do you think? What are some of the ways that authors or storytellers, bring things to the surface so that we can look at them and examine or experience it with them? Is really what we're doing, is we're sharing in that experience with them.
Yeah. I'm not sure how to answer that, but they need to create a situation. So something has to be seen and move forward, and they need a character that feels real.
Mm.
I was looking.
Well, the story you just read does that. It sort of, wants to call attention to an episode in their lives that brings out the kind of thing that shouldn't happen. So I thought that was a real good example of what it was I was going to ask you about anyway.
Oh,
So
thank you. Thank you. And I have just the opening paragraph of a story that I read really just in the past 4 days, written by a local writer named Kathleen George. And she grew up in Johnstown, still lives in Pennsylvania. She wrote a collection of stories called The Man in the Buick. And this is the title story from that collection. The man, well, if you could read backwards. Just the first paragraph, and this is about that issue of creating a situation that makes you say, oh, I need to pay attention. This is somehow about me. Looks across the breakfast table at the younger of her 2 sons, Alan, just home from college at the end of his junior year. And something happens to her that reminds her of Mercury dipping in a thermometer after a few hard shakes. She feels something drop in her. She loves him so much. To think he is hers, this 6-foot-tall man, no longer a boy, a senior in college with his fine light hair, sleepy eyes, and such a kind look about him. Kind. Yes, he looks a little like her father did. Why does she feel when she looks at him? And he looks back so simply that she has lost something, lost him. After this summer, almost certainly his last summer at home, and that's how it should be, she will no doubt see even less of him. It's the beginning of the story. And I would confess that this transience that you feel and that I feel in this first paragraph is certainly something that's on my mind at my age. And I want to know where this goes on this particular day in Fran's life. So it's a, you could say in one sense, it's a very mundane subject, the breakfast table in any home. On the other hand, the writer is going to dive into that and follow this woman to the mall, and where other very interesting things happen. So situation is very important to set that up in storytelling, and then build into it and build from it. Character to me is characters who feel real. are important to me, and Fran is one of those. And Coleman is certainly another one. She's writing nonfiction, but you feel that this is someone who had a real encounter with a harmful exchange.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel the same way about Fran.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to hear more. So those sorts of kind of pulling at our curiosity, I think, have to happen, for me at least.
Authors have so many different tools that they use, and you've mentioned characters, and you've mentioned placement, and we've talked about history. The time and place of a story can either invite you into that time or kind of expound on something that connects with now, that draws you in. But a lot of different tools that an author can use, and that's some of them. Would you care to talk about any others? I mean, there are so many, but
There are so many.
a lot of tools in that basket.
Let's look at Tinkers by Paul Harding. This is a short book, and it's about two generations, really three generations in a family of men. I'll read you about one of the men. His name is George. He lives in Maine and lives near the woods in Maine. This is the very second paragraph of the novel. He had built the house himself, poured the foundation, raised the frame, joined the pipes, run the wires, plastered the walls, and painted the rooms. Lightning struck once when he was in the open foundation, soldering the last joint of the hot water tank. It threw him to the opposite wall. He got up and finished the joint. Cracks in his plaster did not stay cracks. Clogged pipes got routed. Peeling clapboard got scraped and slathered with a new coat of paint. Get some plaster, he said, propped up in the bed, which looked odd and institutional among the Persian rugs and colonial furniture. This man is in bed. He's ill, and he's remembering the colonial furniture and dozens of antique clocks. Get some plaster. Jesus, some plaster and some wires and a couple of hooks. You'd be all set for about $5. Yeah, Gramp, they said. Yes, Dad. A breeze blew through the open window behind him and cleared exhausted heads. Bocce balls clicked out on the lawn. Here's someone who's ill now, older, but he's remembering all of the building things that he did with his life, how he survived a clap of lightning and fixed things. He spent a lot of his lifetime fixing clocks, but now he's a retired superintendent of school, of a high school. I mean, and his father was a tinker. He drove a wagon from village to village, delivering what he could. And he would drive home around twilight. One other important thing for me in the story is that we encounter the world of the senses, are assured that whoever is speaking to us has that contact with sensual life that can come to the fore when it has to. And do you mind if I read?
No, I'm enjoying every minute.
This is George's father. His name is Howard, and he's working as a tinker. He goes out in his wagon every morning on the back roads and does many things. One day he delivers a child. One day he saves a child from drowning. But he's on his way home and it's twilight. And this is just a description of that twilight. And it's one of the powers of this particular writer, Paul Harding. The rutted road ran between two mild slopes. The trees that grew up on the slopes leaned in toward the road so that their lowest branches brushed the grass. The sun lowered and there was brightness in the treetops and brightness in the long grass. And in between, a band of shadows gathered and held in the skirts of the lowest branches. Howard rode along the track and had the sense that once he passed, the shadows leaked out from beneath the edge of the forest, down the incline and out onto the dirt. Behind him also, along with the shadows, animals came to browse in the grass at the verge, and a black-booted red fox darted across the bright road from darkness to darkness. To Howard, this was the best part of the afternoon, when folds of night mingled with bands of day. He resisted the desire to stop the wagon and give Prince Edward, his horse, an apple and crawl into the shadows and sit quietly and become a part of the slow freshet of night. I think that's lovely.
That's beautiful.
And it tells me a lot about George, who loves not being home and being out on the road.
Just being out there.
Right. So I think I need to be assured that the speaker in the story has this ability to engage my senses. Sometimes it's done lyrically, and sometimes it's done through just really good description.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Or good dialogue.
No, I never mind being read to either. I really enjoy it. I remember a time when I was very young, and of course, when you're a little kid, all of your stories have pictures. And my dad was, with us one evening, and he pulled out this big book full of children's stories that had no pictures. I was like, no, I don't want that. He read a story called The Dun Horse, which was an old Indian story, lovely story. And it was just fantastic. And I still remember that. And just the way that he played up the story and read the story, it was so fascinating. So I love being read to, and I don't need pictures anymore. One of the things that happens in stories is a transformation, it seems. Transformation is, sometimes what the story is all about, or sometimes it's what happens with the characters in the story, and that's kind of unfolding as the story grows. Some of the things that you've read tonight, we can see that happening. The woman across the breakfast table experiencing loss, those kinds of things, we can feel it happening. And so another thing that happens is transformation in the readers or the audience of the story. So do you want to comment at all about the kind of transformation that can happen with stories?
It happens at all of those levels that you mentioned, Kate. I think I'm breathless with examples.
Well, you've read quite a few already.
I know.
It just seems to me that that's part of the art of storytelling, that
it is the art, isn't it?
Yeah.
The moment when Coleman recognizes that this man is saying to her, I don't trust you, the store, that's a transformation in the encounter. It's a tiny one, but I just love writers who can attend to those transformations.
And you can see it and you can feel it and
experience it. You can feel it, right? Because it is.
Experience it with them, yeah.
Small anecdote has in it dialogue and description and movement. point to another, and the movement is emotional as well as physical. I guess I could read it's called A Tiny Love Story.
Ooh.
It's just 6 lines.
Oh.
Okay, here we go. I sit in my mother's bed in Michigan. She asks, "How did I make you?" Her eyes are fresh flowers. Her thin arms are stems. "I came from your leg," I answer. When we were young, she convinced my 3 sisters and me that this was how we were born. I run to the fridge before we continue our game. Nothing is there but a box, her hospice package, morphine and pills. She has dementia and doesn't know she is dying. I do. Brave for love, I walk back in. That's the story. And there's a tiny craft in it. I like to look at good examples of small craft. I start to change as a reader.
Mm-hmm.
She mentions the arms are like stems. I think, this can go either way. And then the daughter runs to the speaker, runs to the fridge. And then, of course, when we see what a hospice package is, we understand the situation. But also, I moved now from a sense of kind of warmth and comfort. Oh, I'm sitting on the edge of my mom's bed, and we're sharing old stories. Now to a sense of something more urgent and more difficult for the speaker in this story.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and she's looking for nourishment of some kind. It's not going to be in the refrigerator, so she will have to transform and turn around and be brave for love. So I love that's a great example again of many different kinds of transformation in the speaker, but also in me as a reader as I'm moving through.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that tiny story. Sometimes landscape can carry transformation.
That's true.
There's a story by Sherwood Anderson called "Death in the Woods." A Death in the Woods. It's about a woman who heads out in a very cold winter night to trade some grain for some meat so she can feed her family. But it's a very bad night. It's in the cold Midwest, and she doesn't make it. She dies in the woods. Coyotes drag her around a bit, but all they really want is the grain in her backpack, so they get to that. But she's found. And in the party of those who find her is a young man who's trying to understand what happened. And actually what happens is that he changes as an observer. Starts thinking about the role of woman and this mother who was really just trying to feed her children and how she had been isolated in that role of a feeder. And then he thinks of his own mother. And why should she be feeding me every day? Why shouldn't there be other things?
So that's a powerful question.
The teller of the story changes, as does the woman in this tiny love story. But it's a longer and more drawn out kind of awareness that he grows about what that death in the woods was about. Very interesting. So landscape plays a role in that because he sees her as isolated in this landscape and then thinks about how she's been isolated as a mother. The landscape becomes an actor. And that's possible too. As one of the elements in a story that pulls forward the changes in perception that are happening in a character. Um,
Wow, that's a very powerful story.
yeah, it's it's an interesting narrator. And it's the narrator who you follow in that story more than the woman who dies in the wood.
Hmm.
It is a tragic story, but
It is a tragic story.
what can this young man make of it? And
Yeah.
he made something very interesting out of
Mm.
it. Um,
Hmm. Wow, that has impact.
yeah,
And stories do.
they do.
Yeah. And I often wonder, even just a short story like that can have such a profound impact. And what is it that, calls forth? There are times when I've read whole novels and years later picked them up again and can't even remember having read it.
Yeah,
So
I know.
I will not name any titles, but it's hard to know, when you pick up a book, how do you look at a book and say this is going to be really good? Sometimes
Oh,
the first few lines suck you right in, and other times, you can read a whole chapter or two and go, why am I reading this? So there's
yes.
a variety of quality of writing and of books, and this is one of the reasons I love narrative nonfiction, because it's someone's story. It's not a I can't say the ending was hokey or made up. It's someone's story. It can be very well told or maybe not so well told, but I have to respect the story that it is. And but what is it that makes, as one who teaches writing and can look at a student's work, or a work of fiction or nonfiction, and say, "Oh, this is really quality stuff," or look at something and you go, okay, the kernel is here, but how do you bring it out? So what is it that makes one story really touch and another story maybe not so much? How do you judge a story? Not the book by the cover.
Yeah. Well, I,
Carefully.
yeah, well, yeah, I look for the experience of the writer.
Hmm.
I look for a writer who's had experience creating.
Hmm.
It's hmm,
Some writers play with language. Some writers just try to get to the facts,
yeah, yeah.
um, it's
Hmm.
a lot of tools in that shed.
Any, um, so many acts of writing are daring.
Hmm.
You're never quite sure.
Hmm. That's true,
Yeah, and
especially with the better works.
yeah, um,
Mhm.
I think character is difficult to portray for young writers. I really do.
Mm.
You just need to keep observing and writing and observing and writing.
Mhm.
Try the sketch, get it going, put the person in motion. What do they do? Um, um, I did not teach a lot of what would be called creative writing. I taught
Mhm.
a lot of functional writing. Um, Creative nonfiction, yes, um, but also just advanced writing for the professions. That sort of writing. Um, but there was one course where students really had an opportunity to design what they wanted to experiment with. And a lot of times it would just take two or three drafts to figure out where the best of the story at that point in time was emerging. Just let them go for it. And it might be about an encounter at the mall.
Mm-hmm.
It might be about an encounter on campus. It might be about looking for my father.
Mm.
And or what happened to me at age 16. It would just vary for every writer. But
Yeah.
just try to have on hand good examples of introductory or opening paragraphs, good examples of dialogue, and maybe even some exercises on how to mark dialogue or just put it on the page.
Mm-hmm.
You'd be surprised how finely tuned that can get and how slogged down it can get too, with too much attribution of who spoke what when.
Mm-hmm.
So we worked on speeding up dialogue
Mm-hmm.
down. What if you began with this last paragraph in your piece? Just a lot of experimentation and willingness to move the back to the front, the middle to the front, or sure, maybe go in your next draft.
Mm-hmm.
See if you can remember some dialogue that might fit here. Maybe you need to do a little research on the place itself, visit the place, that sort of thing. Research is one of the tools of strong.
Research is a very good tool. Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes the research is reading other novelists, noticing how they are experimenting with dialogue, with character, with language, just noticing.
Yeah.
And if you want to try it, you can try it. You have a diary. You have a first draft book. It's called your diary. Nice book, whatever you want to call it. Just and those who love writing will just start doing that and do it more and more.
Just go for it. It is. It's an act of courage.
It is.
You're exploring many ways in writing. It is a very.
It is an act of courage. It takes a lot of energy, and
it's a very creative act.
Yeah, we just can't see it all the time. And but I think teachers of writing do see it. They see the energy, they see the drafts, and they commend what is here. Anyway, here's a daring voice, not too daring, but she's a newer writer, Jessamine Ward, and she has a novel, Salvage the Bones. And it's about that year when Katrina hit the Mississippi Bayou. And her characters live there, a family lives there. And she opens the book with the narrator, who is one of the children in the family. Her name is Esh. So this is a challenge of a certain sort, because the narrator, as a child of Mississippi, will speak a certain way, and the rhythms of her speaking will be hers alone. Let's just listen, okay? The first day, birth in a bear bulb place. China is a dog, by the way. China's turned on herself. If I didn't know, I would think she was trying to eat her paws. I would think she was crazy, which she is in a way. Won't let nobody touch her but Skeet. When she was a big-headed pit bull puppy, she stole all the shoes in the house, all our black tennis shoes Mama bought, because they hide dirt and hold up until they're beaten soft. Only Mama's forgotten sandals, thin-heeled and tinted pink with so much red mud seeped into them, looked different. China hid them all under furniture, behind the toilet, stacked them in piles and slept on them. When the dog was old enough to run and trip down the steps on her own, she took the shoes outside, put them in a shallow ditches under the house. She'd stand rigid as a pine when we tried to take them away from her. Now China is giving like she once took away, bestowing where she once stole. She is birthing puppies.
Wow.
China is a dog who will travel a good way into this novel
Oh,
with Esh and with her brothers.
it's obviously a Southern story.
It is a Southern story, and this voice is maintained throughout this novel. That's a lot of work.
What gave it away is the red mud on the shoes.
Mm-hmm. Good.
I've lived in the South and I know what that red mud looks like.
Uh-huh.
Oh, wonderful stories.
Interesting.
You brought a great selection with you this evening. That was just awesome.
Yes, and
We're going to wrap up pretty soon. I don't know if anybody had questions. I didn't ask if anyone was in the audience that wanted to put any questions in the Q&A, but I just wondered if you had anything else you wanted to share with us about the art of storytelling or listening or sharing stories. Any final words?
Find an audience if you want to write.
Yeah.
Join a writing group. There may be one at the library, in fact.
We did have one for a time, but it kind of dwindled over.
Yeah, it's a discipline, Kate, and I have colleagues who have that discipline. My discipline is more academic, didactic, whatever, but I treasure the well-made story. And I don't know if you saw in the Sunday Times the story about a new visitor at Central Park.
No, I did not.
The first paragraph. It was late afternoon in the north woods of Central Park, and the sun was setting fast. Joshua Crystal, a photographer with a penchant for birds, was starting to feel despondent as he searched along the creek, looking for any movement. This was the third time he had traveled more than an hour from Brooklyn to see Manhattan's newest celebrity bird, an ethereal and majestic barred owl. I don't know if you can see the owl. Yeah.
Oh, yes, I can. Wow.
But right away, you know where you are. You know what someone is looking for, what the situation is. And the story takes us through, it's a lovely, well-made story. Takes us through, a few days of hunting to just get a view of this barred owl. Who seems to, by the way, to like publicity. Owls usually don't, but this owl kind of...
What a delight.
The problem is he can't find a mate.
Oh,
so the last paragraph, it's not known if Barry will remain. If he doesn't find a mate, he might decide to stay the winter anyway. Mr. De Candido, who leads bird sighting groups through the Central Park, Mr. Candido said, since food, certainly in the form of rats and chipmunks, is plentiful, he might stay. Or he might head to the suburbs. Mr. De Candido continued, he might decide, this ain't the place to meet women. I'm moving to Jersey City. So there's a playfulness there.
Yes.
Always alert to the well-made story.
Oh. Oh, goodness. Well, I just want to tell you, I have enjoyed all of those delightful readings this evening. That was just so much fun. I haven't had people reading to me for a long time, so that was really nice. It is fun to hear stories. Stories, I think, sometimes are, I do a lot of reading, but I think a lot of stories are meant to be heard rather than just read, But that was very fun. It's a fun way to share stories.
Yeah. Sometimes you can hear things when it's spoken aloud that you can't hear when you read to yourself, too.
Mhm.
And that is intriguing.
Yes, audiobooks.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to, before we wrap up, I just also want to, little announcement for anybody that's listening now, or I know this will be recorded and will be listening after the fact. But I just wanted to remind people that we do have a new crop of books at the library to check out. There are ebooks and audiobooks for so many people are kind of hunkered down at home, and we do have a lot of digital resources that you can access, but ebooks and audiobooks are available that way too in the cloud library. There are a lot of digital materials, courses online, movies. We have great courses. We have Acorn TV, which is British, fun British shows. So all kinds of things that are on the library website for your use. And we do also have book clubs that people can be a part of online, meeting once a month and coming to the Grab and Go. We are offering Grab and Go Monday 4 to 7, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Saturday 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. And so people are able to come and really check out anything in the library, not just books, but also AV materials, DVDs, magazines, board games. If you're home with your kids, please come and take some board games home and enjoy the time that you have with them over the holidays. So lots of good things at the library for you. And I just also wanted to give a big thanks to the Pennsylvania Humanities Council, who have offered us a grant to have some equipment available to continue with these programs, and we really appreciate that. So I wanted to give a shout out to them as well. And thank you, Sue. That was just such a delightful evening. Wonderful way to talk about stories by enjoying stories.
Can I just recommend two podcasts
Sure.
that would be fun to explore if you love stories?
Yes.
Moth Radio Hour, which comes from NPR. You can just Google it, the Moth Radio Hour, MOTH, and selected shorts. You can Google it as well, and you'll find access to any number of short stories, old, current, very current. Oh.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
I love short stories. Sometimes that's all you have time for.
right.
We're proud. Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the evening. And of course, storytelling is near and dear to all of our hearts here at the library. And we really, yeah, keep reading.
Thank you, Kate, for asking me to do this.
Oh, thank you so much. It really is a special night. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Kate. Bye.
Bye-bye.